Your own intelligence community has assessed that the Afghan government will likely collapse.
That is not true.
The first big city to fall was Kunduz. One after another, Afghanistan's biggest cities outside of Kabul were captured. Herat to the west.
Terrorists in Kabul carrying out the deadliest attack on U.S. troops in over a decade.
Afghanistan is lost.
Freedom came under attack. On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes.
At my direction, a small team of Americans carried out the operation with extraordinary courage. They killed Osama bin Laden.
Al-Baghdadi is dead.
It's time to end America's longest war. We'll do it responsibly.
Rushing to the airport, behind them, the sound of gunfire.
Deliberately.
Countless Afghans who helped American troops were left behind.
And safely.
Afghans by the thousands desperate to escape life under the Taliban.
Today I'm speaking with United States Attorney General under President George W. Bush, John Ashcroft. After the September 11th terrorist attacks by al-Qaeda, Attorney General Ashcroft was tasked by President Bush to take action to make sure another attack never happened again. Prior to that, Attorney General Ashcroft served as the governor of Missouri for 9 years, before then being elected to the Senate in 1994. The former Attorney General and Senator has expressed serious concern about the stability of Afghanistan now that the Taliban has taken control once again. It's September 28th, 2021, and we are joined today by Attorney General John Ashcroft, who was there at the very beginning of the war on terror, and we're going to get his point of view on not only the last 20 years, but what the future could hold for Afghanistan and the future of terrorism in this country. Attorney General, thank you for joining us. Attorney General, we just passed the 20th anniversary of 9/11. Hindsight being 2020, what's your emotions and memories of that day now looking back on 20 years of such a tragedy?
Well, it's a matter of great regret that it occurred. It obviously is something that we should learn from. We should make sure it never happens again, or we do whatever we can to displace the resources that were aggregated to make it possible in the first place. The situation in Afghanistan reminds us of the continuing threat of terrorism, especially given the fact that prior to 9/11 20 years ago, the folks in Afghanistan had been involved deeply with terrorist strikes against the United States, but not so much on American soil. Embassies overseas, the coal and the like, the terrorist groups were resourced and frequently found refuge in Afghanistan. And as a matter of fact, President Clinton had actually fired missiles into Afghanistan in retaliation for the acts. So 20 years ago, we learned that terrorism could visit our shores from foreign sources. We'd had some incidents of terrorist activity here in the United States. The Oklahoma bombing was one of those. But foreign-based terror became a reality in a way that we hadn't anticipated.
When you look at that now, then following September 11th, there was a great kind of uniting moment in this country. We're 20 years later, roughly a similar time frame of the presidential administration as when President Bush and your administration had to handle the September 11th attacks. 20 years later, very similar to the Biden administration having to handle what was going on in Afghanistan, the exit of Afghanistan. But at that moment, a nation united after September 11th. Do you feel that we can get there again as Americans, that we can be this united country? Because I think a lot of people watching this, including myself, you see the divide growing deeper every day. It doesn't feel like maybe we've unified and said, yes, the atrocities in Afghanistan, on a big perspective, a lot of people go, well, these are horrible. But it seems quickly people fall back into politics, and it's a different world. But do you feel that there can be uniting again for Americans?
Well, you would sure hope so. It took an assault from outside the country by the terrorists, striking New York, striking civilian populations, striking targets which were symbolic of what we are and what we stand for as a nation, that united us. And since then, we have been successful in keeping those kinds of things from reoccurring. And as a matter of fact, politics, the good politics at that time was to champion the unity of the United States against foreign threats. Some people have come to the conclusion that good politics now is to divide the United States and champion one group in the United States against other groups in the United States, alleging that the United States is not a place that's to be admired or to be a focal point of respecting human dignity and human rights, but is a place somehow where they are disrespected and ought to be rejected. And that really has fostered this disunity, which is very, very different than the unity which we experienced, especially that which followed immediately upon the attacks of 9/11.
We look at that uniting moment, and I mean, it was maybe short-lived. You can say that there were times where it became very contentious, very politically driven, whether it was the war in Iraq or anything that followed. But we're hearing now, coming out of the Pentagon, you obviously were deeply involved in this 20 years ago. I think people are trying to just kind of break down what it all means. Because we've had a relative peace, like you said, there hasn't been a major terrorist attack in this country since September 11th. There had been relative peace for years, or quiet coming out of Afghanistan. But now, the Pentagon has said the resurgence of terror in those regions in Afghanistan is sort of inevitable. What do you say to that to someone who's been there, like yourself, who has been involved in these top-level meetings? What does that mean for us as Americans and stuff we should be looking out for? What is it all, though? It's hard there's a whole generation of people who grew up without real even knowledge of terrorist threats.
Well, let me just say this, that the more terrorist activity there is in Afghanistan, the higher the threat is to the United States. The ability to export terror is something that's a result of technology, communications. If you think of threats as being one component being lethality, how lethal they can be, how destructive they can be, and the other is deliverability. Where can you, now we were protected by oceans for hundreds of years as a country, but we're no longer protected in the same way. And resources that can be assembled, planned in one part of the world can be deployed in another part of the world. So the defense of America and the ability of America to displace or otherwise default plans to attack America can't exist solely in the United States. We have to be aware of what's happening in other places. And one of the reasons we haven't, I think, had intervening attacks in the United States is that we've consciously sought to fight the terrorists there rather than to fight the terrorists here. And it's a problem, obviously, when we have to fight terrorists at all. But I think most Americans would come to the conclusion, better that the fighting be there than that the fighting be here. And if we have decided that we're going to just thinking we can wash our hands of terrorism by leaving an environment in which terrorism will flourish and grow and provide planning, resources, and perhaps launch potential against the United States, it could be that we would be making a very big mistake to think that we can just turn our backs on what happens overseas. The domestic security of the United States can no longer be controlled and determined totally by focusing inside our borders.
That's a great point. That brings me to my next spot, which is a lot of people have been discussing that they've been blaming, whether it was the Trump administration or even going back and blaming the Bush administration that obviously you're involved in, saying that this was inevitable, that we went into a country, we tried to do this, as we're leaving, this was going to be how it was going to be, that it was going to be a crisis in leaving. Are your thoughts that we should have left it all, and was this inevitable? That it ended such chaos?
That's a couple questions, and I think they're susceptible to different sorts of understanding on my part. Anyhow, I do think that we have to be very careful about things developing overseas, and there may be settings where we have to maintain American security interests that secure our homeland, and the securing of the homeland doesn't have to always take place in the homeland. The inevitability of a collapse and the kind of catastrophe which the Brookings Institution has indicated includes sort of the kind of mass killings and things that are human atrocities, that is not inevitable. We've disengaged from other settings on a far more rational and successful basis. And we have, as a matter of fact, this situation was not just a withdrawal. It almost could be labeled a betrayal. There were a substantial group of individuals who were relying on the United States for security. We had, with the Karzai government and other things that were established in the last 20 years, we had done things that would stabilize and provide a basis for people to have a more normalized, may I use that term, in terms of world setting, lives in Afghanistan. And withdrawal that results in an immediate takeover, including the kind of chaotic pursuit of people who were simply friendly to the United States and its imposition of order there. That's not inevitable. And nobody believes it's inevitable in the world community. The NATO forces don't believe it. The Brits, obviously, in convening a special parliamentary session and censuring the President of the United States, didn't believe it. They've been our closest ally in helping understand the necessity and opportunity for maintaining stability, which could actually make us safer here and make Britain safer in the British Isles. They don't believe that it was inevitable, but right. Now it's not easily correctable once it's happened. But we have to accept where we are and move on.
I mean, that is one of the concerns is, President Biden laid out his plans to, America was back. A lot of the EU and the UK seemed to be praising him at that moment. Things have shifted. And you said like the British armies did not think this was inevitable. How do we now regain the trust of those and very important allies who feel like we've abandoned them? We've seen, people go on record saying, we can't really rely necessarily on the United States like we once would, for better or worse in that sense. But how do we regain that respect from these allies who now feel, like you said, like we've abandoned them?
Unfortunately, you can burn a house down in 20 minutes that may take you 20 years to build. And rebuilding trust is a much more arduous and difficult process than destroying trust. And what I reject is that the idea that America's involvement is only valuable in terms of stabilizing other places. America's involvement, intelligent involvement, moderated involvement, and cooperated involvement, meaning it with other nations, is valuable in sustaining the peace and security of the United States itself. And one of the difficult outcomes of the sense of betrayal that our allies have felt, because this was done so unilaterally right. and precipitously against the advice of our friends, is that it's going to be harder to get them to cooperate with us. And I must commend the prior administrations. Yes, they were involved overseas as a part of their defense strategy for the United States, but they almost always were able to enlist the cooperative effort of the other NATO countries of Europe and literally countries from around the world in that were interested in security and in the repression of terrorism. Fighting terrorism has been important. It's done best cooperatively with other nations, and the development of coalitions to fight them is tougher.
Absolutely, and you brought up specifically the way that the world kind of united against terrorism. And now, when you were Attorney General is when we all started to kind of get the term the Taliban into the lexicon of the American people. Now, 20 years later, to hear the name the Taliban brought into conversations with respect and treated like a legitimate government. As someone who was a teenager in the September 11th attacks in that time, it's mind-boggling to hear the Taliban treated like a legitimate government. But for someone like you who was deeply involved, what does it feel like for you to hear that?
Well, I view it as a compromise, and not as a positive compromise, but as a compromise of American values. To endow a group that really betrays the idea of human rights for all of humanity, that seeks to impose religious belief in law on the rest of humanity without their consent, which treats women in ways that are totally disrespectful of the human dignity that women deserve, is a real setback. And frankly, the Taliban ends up stronger now, perhaps than ever before, by inheriting a situation which had been built, strengthened, and structured by our presence. There are assets in the Afghan culture that are a result only of our involvement there, which it's almost as if we had given foreign aid in advance to this very, very destructive political community called the Taliban. They take over both infrastructure and hardware and a governmental structure that I don't think they could ever have assumed or developed on their own. So they've capitalized on our effort to provide a basis for humane treatment and human dignity and the right values, and those have been converted now in ways to destructive ends that are threatening. And unfortunately, in one respect, they're not only threatening to the people there, the threat to people around the world has been elevated.
Absolutely, and that's something we've heard repeated over and over in a lot of these interviews with a lot of people who are deeply concerned about that. And I guess the big question that we all have is, where do we go from here? This is a month past us essentially getting out of Afghanistan completely, roughly a month since that happened. From your point of view, is this something we just need to look to our politicians? Is there anything we can do? What do we do as American people? And where would you take us? Where would we go from here?
Well, it's very difficult. We're backed up against the goal line, and it's 4th and 100, and so we do have to make the best of a bad situation. First of all, we'll have to cooperate and try and develop the trust and cooperation of other nations. Unfortunately, that will probably require us to yield more to international organizations than we would otherwise have to yield to. But the United Nations Security Council has already passed resolutions that call upon the Taliban to adjust its behavior in ways that would somehow be less threatening to the world community. Our ability to be the leader in that setting is diminished substantially by this kind of disaster that characterized the withdrawal. So we have to do the best we can to protect our own interests and to join with other international interests that have the same things at stake that we do. But we won't be doing it from a leadership position because at least in the minds of many that have already spoken, they feel like our previous actions were a betrayal. And I should clarify that it's not that it was thought that we would be there indefinitely, although that we've been in many other settings indefinitely. We still have troops in Korea and Europe and a variety of places around the world. But the fact that we acted against the advice and cooperation and without giving proper notice and consideration to our allies makes cooperating with them in the future more difficult. They'll be less likely to say, well, if you say so, that's the way we're going. They're going to say, wait a second, last time we had an effort to cooperate and coalesce around mutual objectives, the rug was pulled from beneath us, and we've got to be acting with greater care.
Absolutely. We're going to start to wrap up this conversation. The way we've kind of done a lot of these, you were someone who was there day one from the war on terror. Knowing that we did have 20 years of a lot of good that happened. But knowing the ending, do you believe that this decision was the right decision to make to get involved in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I do. I think you have to look at the 20 years of relative calm in the United States and in a variety of other settings that came from the displacement of the terrorist agenda in Afghanistan. It was the maintenance of the peace. It was fighting them there instead of fighting them here. And I think we would always hope that we could eventually have a long-term peace, but we would also say that, we've got to be grateful for what we avoided in terms of terrorist activity. And I think, so what I'm saying is the last 20 years were pretty successful in repressing terrorist activity. And you look at a variety of other terrorist groups that sought to assemble resources and gain momentum there. They were either taken out or severely diminished in their capacity during the 20-year period, and that's valuable. I don't know that you do anything that has infinity or forever involved, but 20 years is something to be grateful for, and I think it marks some success. To end it all, though, with a collapse undermines the idea of the success which had been attained.
Well, it's heartbreaking for a lot of people, and a lot of families are asking, did their family die in vain? Were they injured in vain? Soldiers who have come back and said, we've had 20 years of working on this, and this is how it all ends. Was it worth it? So I don't want us to forget the 20 years that has passed and only focus on the last month that occurred, in the last year even. What's your response to that, to these troops, to these soldiers, their families, and the people that served, to make sure that those people are not forgotten?
Well, the biggest response is a thank you. Is a thank you that the United States has been largely free from the kind of terrorist activity that had been spawned in previous decades in the Middle East and in the Afghanistan community in specific. And so the effort was not in vain. It resulted in substantial peace and freedom from terror. It's something we're going to have to guard against, though, and our guard will probably have to be elevated as a result of now the way in which the Taliban has been able to regain a very clear upper hand, and an upper hand endowed with resources that they probably never dreamed they would be able to have in command.
Thank you so much, though, for taking a few minutes out of your day to discuss not only the history, but also the future of what's going to happen in that area of the world and how that impacts us as Americans. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for your good work on this. Bringing these factors into the awareness of the American public is a service that's much to be appreciated.